Dean, in trying to understand what God is all about, I hear the term perfect being, and it's expressed in many of different God's so-called characteristics: all powerful, all knowing, all good, all free. What does it mean to be a perfect being? How can you be perfect?
Well, the very idea of a greatest possible being or most perfect being suggests that there's a single scale or spectrum of better and worse along which you could line up every possible kind of being there is. And of course, some people are going to question that or wonder about that. I mean, some goods seem almost incommensurable. You know, if you ask, well, is Hamlet greater than
Mozart?
Yeah, it's like, some particular piece of music. Maybe they can't really even be compared. So there might still be an upper end on the spectrum of possible beings. Even if some of them can't be compared directly, there still might be a possible kind of being that is greater, better in every respect than everything else.
That makes eminent sense, that there is that possibility.
And if it is possible, and God is down here somewhere, there's something wrong with that.
That I agree with that. But I can see you can have a greatest possible being, because beyond that you can't compare things or whatever. But why is that perfect? Well, why do we use the word perfect as opposed to greatest possible? Those are not synonymous. They're not the same thing.
I wouldn't argue with someone who wanted to distinguish them. But I would want to suggest that if there is a greatest possible being, that had better be God. And I'm not sure what you mean by perfect, if such a being wouldn't be perfect. If it's not perfect, then there's an imperfection. If it's an imperfection, then it could have been greater.
Okay, well that's interesting. If there's an imperfection, but to me, greatest possible means that there is a scale that you can use, mm-hmm. and that there is something at the top, even though there may be incommensurable things you can't compare, that doesn't matter. You could still be the greatest and have differences in certain respects. But I don't understand why that has to be perfect. What is it about that greatest possible thing that is, unless you're defining perfection in that way? Are you defining perfection as the greatest possible being?
Well, let me throw it back at you and ask you, what do you mean by an imperfection? What is it for something to be less than perfect? Is it to lack something?
I don't know.
To be less than ideal in some respect? And if so, the greatest possible being is not going to be less than ideal.
Well, it's something that can be the greatest possible, but yet still not ascend to the level of perfection that you would require. It's the greatest possible that you can't logically get higher than that, but it's not perfection.
I'm not sure how to understand what you just said, but let me try.
Okay.
Suppose that the attributes that we want to say are perfections, or they come in various degrees, and the highest degree is a perfection. Let's say perfect knowledge is complete knowledge. Less than complete knowledge is imperfect. Perfect power is absolute power to do anything, and anything less than that is an imperfection.
So what you're now doing is defining perfection in terms of greatest possible.
In terms of the highest member of some ordering of attributes.
Okay.
So
the perfection depends upon the scale of greatest. So that's fair. I mean, you can do that.
And one reason to think that the greatest possible being might not be perfect in every way is if you think these attributes are not compatible. The highest levels of these attributes are not compatible with one another.
For example,
complete knowledge and power and goodness, and also complete freedom. complete freedom to do all sorts of things. So if something is, some being is perfectly good, you might think this means they can't even be tempted to do wrong.
So then that means they're not perfectly free.
Right.
So therefore you have an incompatibility between two kinds of perfections.
Yeah. So a being could have the kind of power we want to attribute to God, the kind of knowledge we want to attribute to God, but be able to do all sorts of things that we think would be bad. This being we might want to say this being is chaotic neutral in the gamer's sense of these terms, as opposed to lawful good, which is what we think God ought to be. So the chaotic neutral deity in some ways is more free than the lawful good God that we think is more worthy of worship.
And the reason we do this is if the claim is that the God of certainly the Judeo-Christian philosophical tradition is this perfect being, if there's some incoherence there, that might call question to the whole concept of what this God is, or does this God really exist? So this is not a philosophical just exercise, but has some real substance to it.
Well, if you're committed to God being both the greatest possible being and also having the maximum of all these attributes, and the greatest possible being couldn't have the maximum of all these attributes, or maybe nothing could because they're incompatible, well, then you're in trouble. If you're committed only to God as a being that could not be surpassed in greatness, where this greatness is a kind of overall assessment of greatness, then if some of these attributes have to give way to others
in defining what greatness is,
then in order for the overall package of these attributes to give you the greatest possible being, it may be that some of them have to be, so to speak, turned down. Now that doesn't mean that the resulting being is not as great as some other. It just means that the greatest possible being does not have some of these attributes in their maximum amount.
And so the concept of perfect being theology is to deal with all of these things in order to discern what a greatest possible being would be. For example, if I have real human freedom, so-called libertarian freedom, that means in some sense God is not all-powerful because God is not forcing me to do exactly what God wants. God's limiting God's own power to give me some independent capabilities. And we might define that as the greatest possible being, which is a being of less power in a sense.
Right. So these perfections, so to speak, we should say having more of them, other things being equal, makes a thing better. However, having more of them and having less of something else might not be so good. So the greatest possible being may well want to tone down the control and the knowledge in order to be great in other ways. So to be a loving being in relationship to and vulnerable to other creatures, that may be a greater being than one that's in control of everything.